Welcome to Winston-Salem's Gold. As we celebrate our 250th anniversary of our nation's independence, we thought it would be a good time to tell the story of the Revolution as it played out right here in Winston-Salem. We're standing in the middle of Old Salem, a place of strategic importance where its inhabitants, the Moravians, found themselves caught between two warring armies. Let's walk over to the Old Tavern now to meet with Jacob Chilton, one of Old Salem's interpreters, and hear how the Revolution began here.
Jacob, hi.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for meeting me.
Glad to have you.
So when we talked on the phone, you said this was the spot to start our story off. What makes this the perfect place?
I'm glad you asked. So the tavern here, this was actually a site of a lot of things happening during the American Revolutionary War. We had soldiers coming through the area buying supplies, food, and drinks with the townsfolk or with the tavern, but it's also the site where the Declaration of Independence was nailed to the broadside here at the tavern on August 6th back in 1776, and it was proclaimed for the townsfolk and for any residents of the county who happened to be passing through.
Oh, wow. So what was the reaction when this went up? What did the Moravians think?
So for the Moravians in particular, their response in the records, it was, and I quote this, "We sighed within our hearts." It was a bit of mixed bag for them, a bit of a scary bit of news, really. Yeah. Today, we have the gift of hindsight to be able to see what the conclusion of the war was, but for them, they had no idea what was going to be coming next.
So they were being a little non-committal, it sounds like.
They were quite non-committal, and there's a few reasons as to why. So this county, they had a lot of diverse opinions here, and a lot of the folks here were business partners with diverse opinions. So if you state an opinion, you might alienate some people, but there were some big political consequences for choosing the wrong side as well. The provincial Congress, they wanted everyone to enlist with them in order to support the war effort. But for the Moravians, they weren't able to necessarily do that because their land here was held in a trust in England. There was simply too much of it for them to purchase up front. They purchased upwards of 100,000 acres that today make up most of modern-day Forsyth County. And the trust for that was held back in London.
So if you cross the British or the Loyalists, you might lose all your land holdings.
Correct.
And if you cross the Patriots, well, these are your neighbors and they might not be real happy with you either.
Right, so they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Wow. Or I'd like to put it as two arguing family members. Yeah. And no one wants to take either side in something like that.
So that's sort of the church. What did the common folks think?
For the common folks, they had a bit of a diversity of opinions, but I think it may be a better conversation to have actually inside the pub where a lot of those talks would have been had.
All right, lead the way.
Absolutely. So this here is the tavern's public room, or pub for short, and this is where a lot of gentlemen would have been able to enjoy some drinks and maybe some light refreshments and snacks, but it's also where a lot of news for the period would have been shared amongst other travelers, either through newspapers or by simply what we're doing right now, talking with one another.
Right, so the Declaration was big news.
It was quite big news, and it was divisive news at the time. Again, we have that gift of hindsight. We know where this is going, but for the men who would have been sitting at tables like this, sitting across from one another, they might have very different opinions from one another. You might have had a gentleman on one side of the table who was very much in favor of the Continental cause and wanted to secede from Britain, and then a gentleman across the table who might have a sister or other family members back in London, and to secede from that country means cutting yourself off potentially from family members.
Yeah, you have a little mini version of the Civil War that's going to play out in the war more broadly, happening right here with these opinions. So what does the church do in response to this conflicts or potential conflict within their own congregation and their community?
So after they side within their hearts, as we said up front, they then put out a statement to the citizens of the town here. They'd stated if anyone had asked questions, that they are to keep their opinions to themselves. They also had stated that if someone had started to ask questions and press them for their opinions, to plead ignorance.
Yeah, and all of this I just don't know anything about that. Thank you.
It's none of my business. I have no idea.
Yeah. You told me a great story earlier. You said there were the apprentices of a potter who were doing they were kind of fooling around out on the street. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so the master potter at the time, Gottfried Aust, he had two apprentices named Rudolf Christ and Gottlob Kraus. And these two gentlemen, they decided that they were going to have some fun with customers waiting in line for pottery one day. One of them began shouting, "All hail King George," which, as you might imagine, was a bit inflammatory, and the other gentleman made it quite a bit worse by shouting "Washington" after that.
Right, so alienating everybody and turning it into a bit of a powder keg here, right?
Yeah, they were just being teenagers at the time and just trying to have fun. They didn't really understand the weight of the actual consequence of doing something like that at the time, and both were quite heavily reprimanded.
Yeah, everything is kind of on the line here for the Moravians. They could see their town burn if they say or do the wrong thing, right?
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about like how, they can't keep the war off their doorstep forever. And it arrives with Cornwallis, right? And the Over Mountain Men as well.
Yes. So for years, the Moravians had been requisitioned supplies to the British Army or in the Continental Forces, supplying whichever army came through. As long as they needed food, money, clothing, as long as it was not against their conscience and not doing any direct harm to people, they were happy to offer supplies. But then the armies came through here in force in the 1780s, particularly after the Battle of Kings Mountain, with the Over Mountain Men and their prisoners who would arrive at Bethabara in 1780.
Yeah, and I know we have Jacob Cruz lined up to tell us a bit about that over in Bethabara, and then we're going to come back and chat with you a little bit about Cornwallis and when he arrives here and what happens in Salem. But for now, off to Bethabara, and we'll be back to chat again.
We'll be happy to have
Jacob, thank you so much.
Likewise,
Appreciate your time.
Thank you for your time.
So, Jacob, tell us where we are and why this road we're on is important to our story.
Yeah, this road's really neat. It's this surviving connector from Bethabara to the Great Wagon Road. So when you look at people coming in and out of Wachovia throughout the 18th century, this is the path they're going to come in. They're going to come off the Great Wagon Road here to the Bethabara mill site and then come into town. And if you keep going straight through town, you'll end up back in Salem.
Nice. Okay. So this is sort of where and how the war begins to touch Wachovia.
Exactly, yeah. So just like anyone else, if an army is going to come through, this is the road they're going to use. And people are coming here for all kinds of supplies and things like that. That's what an army needs.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, armies, don't carry a lot of stuff with them. They're kind of living off of the land.
So Wachovia looks like kind of a plum to this army where all the stuff is.
It's right for the picking for sure. And we've seen that throughout the war by this point. So even when we talk about 1780, this isn't new to the Moravians. Mm-hmm. They've already been dealing with this. People showing up at their door saying, hey, you owe us blank. So.
Gotcha. So Cornwallis, he's the general who's on the British side,
right,
on the loyalist side.
Yes.
And so he is the guy who's kind of leading this southern strategy for the British. Tell us a little bit about what that is.
Cornwallis is a British army commander with a British army. So these guys are from, England. Mm-hmm. They've already successfully pacified Georgia. Georgia's back in the hands of the British. They've taken Charleston. He's wrapping up South Carolina. Where's he going to head next? He's going to head north. And their goal here is kind of twofold. They want to really cut George Washington off from the supplies that he's getting from the South. The South has been able to give him a lot of agriculture, like the things coming here from Bethabara, a lot of agricultural products, foodstuffs, things like that. He also, British leadership really firmly believes that there are lots of loyalists here. So Americans who are going to choose to stay faithful to the crown. And so he's convinced that he can create an army down here. And in fact, he actually sends a really well-trusted officer, Patrick Ferguson, to the western flank of his army. So over here where we are today, western North Carolina, western South Carolina. And his job is going to be to gather these loyalists together, give them protection, give them weapons, and train them on being British soldiers.
Build an army.
Exactly.
Okay. And so what happens? I think this brings us to these Over Mountain Men, yeah?
It does, yeah. So the Over Mountain Men are going to hear about Ferguson. They're going to be really nervous about this all well-equipped loyalist army. They've been fighting these guys for a few years now. They've been fighting the Cherokee. So they're really invested in the war. And so when they hear now, okay, not only do we have to worry about the Cherokee, but now we have to worry about all these loyalists to our east, we're a sandwich and it's not a good one.
Yeah.
So the Over Mountain Men are going to take it upon themselves to gather together with their militia commanders, guys like Ben Cleveland, like William Campbell, Sevier, Shelby, Joseph Winston is going to be in charge of the guys from here.
Our Winston-Salem guy.
Exactly, yeah. So he actually is one of the famous heroes of Kings Mountain. They're going to gather together. Some of them are going to come over the Blue Ridge. They're going to gather and they're going to march after Ferguson. They're going to chase him.
Okay, so this is like a patriot force.
It is, yeah. It's patriots, and there's no regular American officers, no Continental Army, no George Washington. These are just guys in their communities who organize to get the job done. And they're going to catch Ferguson eventually at a place called Kings Mountain in 1780. And they're going to fight a really pitched battle there. They're going to win. And it's not even really very close. They're going to win pretty badly. They planned the battle. The battle went well. What they didn't plan is for the aftermath. So here they are left with 700 prisoners of war that they've captured. and no plan and no Continental Army supply train to help
Right.
get stuff for the, right? So they're left with all these guys and they panic a little.
So it's a big problem.
Yeah, it's a really big problem.
And
Yeah.
so this is like, they're out in the frontier,
Right.
and the first sign of civilization is,
It's here.
Yeah.
They know they have to get away from Cornwallis. They're convinced that Cornwallis is going to send an army to come catch them and get his prisoners back, or get his men back who are their prisoners. So they want to go away from Cornwallis, who's coming up through Charlotte. So northwest is the direction, right? And so they're going to go northwest. And when you look at a map, 1780 North Carolina, there's not a lot in the western part of the state. And Bethabara is this, like you said earlier, this place that looks ripe for the picking, where they can settle down, feed their men, maybe even feed the prisoners of war, and figure out what your next steps are.
okay, so this is sort of how the war arrives in Wachovia.
Yeah,
is
they're
with
gonna
these guys,
they're gonna
these 800
march in
prisoners.
somewhat unexpectedly. The Moravians hear about it about 24 hours in advance, and all of a sudden you're gonna have 700 men is what they have left. So about 400 prisoners of war, about 400 guards, something like that. 760 or so are just gonna march right up this road into Bethabara and immediately demand food.
That's a lot of mouths to feed.
It is,
All right,
yeah.
Let's head over here
Yeah,
and
let's
kind of
go.
check out what they saw when they arrived.
All right, so we're stepping here out of the woods into Bethabara, and this is probably really similar to what their experience would have been. You have been out in the frontier, you've fought this battle, you've been on the trail, and you're gonna step out to this town, this very established town.
Yeah, this is quite a like a piece of civilization when you're coming out of the woods.
Right, all of a sudden here you are in this town with these Germanic buildings and a bakery and cows and ducks and geese running around, and I'm sure they were very excited about those parts because that checks that box, right? Here's the supplies that we've been looking for.
So we walk into town and we have 800 people with us, this army.
Right, yeah.
Where do you put 800 people?
That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? So the Moravians, they have thought about this a little bit, and they are going to assume everyone's going to camp together, and so they've cleared off some of the fields on the northwestern side of town.
Okay.
So let's head up that way and start up there, and we'll come back this way.
Sounds good.
So when the prisoners arrive, a little bit before the prisoners arrive, the Moravians are going to clear out a field they call the Great Meadow. And they're going to stick the enlisted militia prisoners in that meadow field. There's going to be a fence around it. They're going to have guards, no tents, no blankets, kind of just out in the elements.
Well, this is like November, right?
Yeah. So we're talking late October, early November by this point.
So this is really kind of cold and miserable. Why stick guys out in a field when you got a town here and you got Salem a couple miles away?
That's a great question. So the Moravians, these are still strangers. These aren't Moravians, and the Moravians still want to protect themselves. So that's part of it. They know that not the best things are happening in this scenario, right? You've got prisoners of war, you've got guards, things are tense. So they're going to put them outside of town for that reason. The other reason is, you bring up Salem. Salem is what's called the Gemein Ort, and that just means it's like the center city, and it's to be protected. It's the center of Moravian religion here in North Carolina, and they want to protect it. So we even see the leaders like Tragobaga over in Salem are coming here to Bethabara and saying, hey, keep these guys here. So the Moravians are really wanting this to be temporary. The field's the temporary solution, and keeping them in Bethabara is the solution so they don't have to go to Salem.
Gotcha. And I think what I read was to your point that this is sort of a dicey situation, right? And this is tense. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's really tense. So you have to think about it. These men just fought a battle against each other. So you've got friends on both sides who have been killed in the fighting. You also have wounded loyalists still who are going to be here in this militia camp. In fact, we have a really good account of the surgeon who was with the Loyalist Army under Ferguson. His name's Uzzel Johnson. He's going to be coming up here and trying to treat some of these wounded men who are just kind of left out. He does note that some of them were wounded during the battle and some of them have been wounded since. So to speak towards that tension, right, there are men who've been slashed with swords and clubbed with guns and things on the march down, these prisoners. So there's a lot of brutality happening on both sides. Uzzel actually comes out here in response to a man who's been cut with a saber. And as he's trying to operate on this man and get him to stop bleeding, he's actually assaulted by one of the Patriot leaders, Ben Cleveland, and knocked unconscious with the hilt of his sword.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So things are tense here.
Things are really tense. And the Moravians, can you blame them for being like, hey, let's keep that over there? You know, we don't want that in our town where we're trying to,
So these are all enlisted men kept up here. What happens to the officers?
So the officers and the provincials who are loyalists but are actual members of the British Army, they're not just militia, they're going to actually be kept in the town. So let's go down there and talk about some of the places they were kept. So in 1780, this would have been the center of Bethabara. You're gonna have the church, you're gonna have the store, the bakery, all the important main buildings here. And on this square, there's two buildings where prisoners of war are held. That's gonna be in the store and in the Gemeinhaus here in front of us. And those are both gonna be two of the larger buildings. So it makes sense that's where you'd put prisoners. And these are gonna be those provincial soldiers, the enlisted men, and the militia officers, the loyalist officers. And so these men are, you know, viewed with a little bit of a different status, but that violence from up on the hill is still spilling down here.
Yeah.
And we're gonna see, go back to Uzzel Johnson, our surgeon that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Once again, he's gonna be kind of caught in the middle of it. He tells us the story of an angry militiaman who's been out in the cold. It's November, can you blame him? Who busts through the door to this store and demands that these prisoners give up their accommodations because it's much better than the hill that he's sleeping.
Yeah, why are you guys in the nice warm cabin while I'm freezing?
Right,
Yeah,
and so these tensions have just built and built and built, and it ends up being the Patriot militia officers who are constantly having to get in the middle, like Joseph Winston.
Yeah.
We know Joseph Winston's viewed as a friend of the Moravians, and he's constantly having to break up these literal fights that are happening.
And I remember you said Cleveland was the guy who did the smashing on the head of the doctor.
Yeah.
And down here in this square right here, tell me a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so Cleveland is really well known to the Moravians already. Earlier in September of the same year, some of his men, some men under his command, it's not super clear if he's actually here with them though, they're gonna be here in this square and they're gonna flog loyalists. They're gonna hold essentially mock trials. They're actually gonna hang one man over behind our distillery. But to understand this, you know, this has been building for years, right?
Yeah.
You've got, you know, all of these tensions, these different battles, these small skirmishes where people have lost friends, family, right? And it's all kind of coming to a head here at Bethabara in this town that's really trying to stay out of it.
Yeah, and it makes me think, like, in our minds, usually the Patriots were like, these are the guys who are the good guys, but out here it sounds like they're kind of doing some questionable stuff.
Yeah, well, and it's just a difference in leadership, right? Cleveland, that's kind of how they call them the devils. That's how his men handled things. Where when you have Joseph Winston and more Surrey County militia, more local guys take over the guard roles, the Moravians even note, hey, things have calmed down a lot. Actually, things are kind of good now. We're even going to move the prisoners closer to town. Yeah.
So, like, if we're trying to understand the Patriots and why some of this tension spills over, like, kind of set the scene for us. Why are these guys, you know, what are the stresses they're under?
Yeah, so I mean, again, you have the losses throughout the war. You see a lot of land disputes are spilling over into the war because, again, these are neighbors. These guys know each other. So you're going to see a lot of that, and you're going to see a lot of anger just because of the situation. None of these guys signed up to be prison guards. None of them signed up to be starving. None of them signed up to cross, you know, a whole state now twice.
And they just come from a big battle.
Right, and they want to go home. And can you blame them, right?
Yeah, so these guys are just sort of human, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's really just the tensions of war on both sides are breaking out. In this case, the Loyalists have a lot more to lose, so they're really playing chill.
Yeah. So the plan that Traugott Bagge had to sort of keep all of this danger up and away from Salem is not going to hold, right?
The situation has really changed by 1781. And when Cornwallis comes through with this huge main British army, they're going to march right through on that road behind us. In the 18th century, the Moravians call that the road to Salem. And Cornwallis is going to come from Bethania on that road and head straight from here to Salem. So Baga's about to have to face the main British army on his doorstep.
Wow. Well, it sounds like to finish our story, we have to get ourselves back over to Salem.
I think you've got to.
Jacob, thank you so much for your time and filling us in on this part of the story.
It was wonderful speaking with you, Jeremy.
All
Thanks.
right. Take care.
Morning, Jeremy.
Hey, good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
So we were just up at Bethabara talking to the other Jacob, and he was telling us all about, you know, this amazing story of the Overmountain men and the prisoners there, and then, you know, the inevitable march of the British Army down here into Salem.
Yeah.
And so we're here at the Muddy Creek Cafe, and can you tell us how that kind of fits into that story?
Yeah, of course. So obviously today it's a cafe, but back then this used to be the general store for the community, and it was run by a man named Traugott Bagge, who for several years acted as the administrator for the church here. So whenever anyone came through for supplies or to speak to the Moravians, he often was the face of the town and spoke for everybody.
Gotcha. So when Cornwallis was marching in, he was going to stop here and talk to Traugott Bagge.
Absolutely, and he did stop by here at the store.
Okay. So you mentioned that downstairs in this cafe, there's this old storeroom where those supplies were kept, and we could see all of that.
Yes, in fact, let me bring you back around the back so you can actually take a look at it.
Okay, fantastic.
So as the theater of the war moved north, Cornwallis marched his army up through Salem, and he came here to the general store, which would have had a host of supplies here stored in its cellar. Down here, this would have been the original cellar for the store, and here they would have had barrels, boxes, and shelves of all kinds of supplies that a starving army might need.
You can see all this old, all these old stone walls and everything. This is sort of how it looked in the 1700s.
More or less. It's missing some of its supplies, of course, but these are the same walls that would have been standing at that time.
Okay.
When Cornwallis came through, however, he likely would have been speaking with Bog upstairs. So let's actually head into the old house and we can actually see where they would have been at.
Great. So it seems like the store owners back then lived where they worked. And so this was sort of the work side and the personal side was maybe over here.
Yes. So they would have had two sections on their houses, most people did. But the residential space would have been on the southern side of the building that we're walking into. So this room here would have served as Traugott Baga's living space. And in February of 1781, it is also where he would have been witnessing over 2,000 British soldiers marching outside of his window. And eventually, one of the officers of the army came to him and stated that Lord General Charles Cornwallis had requested a visit with him.
Yeah, requested.
Requested. It's pretty hard to deny him with that many men and that many guns out front. But by all accounts, once he received Cornwallis here, it was a rather cordial visit, and he had been making a fairly strong request for supplies from the community, as armies often did during this period. And of course, the Moravians at this point, they were obliged to fulfill that request.
So I thought the Moravians had signed some kind of an agreement that was, they wouldn't help the British.
That is correct. They did take the affirmation of allegiance, where they wouldn't aid enemies of the state.
So what was the reaction among the Patriots to them supplying British troops like that?
It was a great sense of betrayal the Continentals felt. The Moravians were in a hard position to decline, but the enlisted men of the Continental forces, they were underfed, undersupplied, and feeling a great sense of betrayal at the Moravians having done this.
Right, these guys are putting their lives on the line here, and their neighbors are like feeding the enemy, huh?
That's exactly the way they saw it. So their officers, like Major Joseph Winston, he tried to temper some of their anger and was able to successfully do so in some instances. But some of those men were quite frustrated. They were coming through the town needing supplies and often taking them when they weren't granted. They were insulting the Moravians, and at two different occasions held Traugott Baga at gunpoint.
At gunpoint, wow.
At gunpoint.
That's serious.
Yes, it is quite serious. But again, thanks to men like Winston and other officers, along with the level heads in the Moravian church, they were all able to diplomatically make their way through the tribulations and come out the other end having proven their character as good people who were in favor of the cause of liberty.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, for taking us through that part of the story. I appreciate it.
I'm very happy to have shared it with you, Jeremy. Thank you for asking.
See you again soon.
Likewise, see you soon.
After Cornwallis leaves Salem, he ends up facing Joseph Winston and other patriots under Nathaniel Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in what's now Greensboro. Cornwallis is eventually driven from North Carolina and into Yorktown, Virginia, where he's defeated by George Washington, signaling the end of the war, which makes what happened here in North Carolina a decisive turning point in the struggle for independence. 2 years later, the governor of North Carolina issues a formal proclamation asking residents to celebrate the 4th of July as a day of Thanksgiving. The Moravians here respond with a day of prayer, music, and thanks, while the whole place was lit up with candles in every window. As this plaque here commemorates, it was one of the earliest official 4th of July celebrations on record, and it happened right here in Salem's town square. I'm Jeremy Cole for the City of Winston-Salem. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about our local revolutionary history. Be sure to check out the show notes to learn more about how to visit these locations for yourself. And we'll see you on the next one.